So, I'm here to talk about the cultural construction of Drupal. You can still leave. There's still time. I won't be offended. One guy already did. I don't know if this is relevant, but... So, Todd, if you're thinking about becoming a back-end developer...
I could use a change.
Okay. I'll leave that one alone. All right, so recently I've written a number of articles about Drupal and the culture, and they have a lot of words in them. And not everybody wants to read long-worded articles, and I don't care if you don't want to read long-worded articles, that's fine. But I did think I could take some of the ideas from a couple of these articles and put them into a talk and condense it down to some of the highlights, although I'm probably going to say more than that many words, I would think, in this time, so we'll see. But it might be faster just to read some of the articles. But
I'm not leaving, I just need to sit right over there and shake my head so much.
So,
You said you could leave it.
No, I'm not leaving, I just can't twist my neck like that for now.
that's smart. So this is mostly about the first kind of article in there, and which is, in a way, examining what Drupal is, deconstructing Drupal, sort of examining some of our underlying beliefs, looking at how we talk about Drupal, what we say about it, how we act, and then sort of considering what that means. But really, I'd like to think of this more as, like to think of myself more as a materialist, meaning in the sense of like historical materialism, where I'm interested in ideas, but also actually changing our material world. So I look at these things sort of from a, what people would say, like philosophical point of view, but really my ultimate goal is to help understand our community in order to help change it for the better, in order to understand it better, and, I don't know, be a better citizen. So, there's lots of stories about Drupal that we tell, but since we're here, I mean, one way to understand Drupal is that it's software we use here in Minnesota. So, this is the Twin Cities Drupal camp, and so Drupal then is the thing that brought us here to create a camp, and it, at the same time, we came because it enables us in our local organizations or the people that we work for or the organizations in our community to do kinds of things. So it's another way to look at Drupal. So we have sort of specific, organizations that become the face of Drupal then. The University of Minnesota, where we are right now, standardizing on Drupal, then, is Drupal to some extent. It helps create Drupal. It helps create Drupal sites to get its messages out. Minnesota Public Radio is another big local organization, so they use it for their website, and as well as other internal sites, and the St. Paul Public Library. There's lots of Drupal in Minnesota. So that's kind of my point here. Mayo Clinic's another one. And by working with these local organizations, by talking about our work with them, we create stories about Drupal, and that essentially helps us define it. So that is kind of what this talk is about, is this construction. So all of these kinds of things just play into our local conception of Drupal. But there's other narratives that have been in the Drupal community to describe what it is that I've been a little bit more interested in, and particularly this idea that Drupal leaves small websites behind. And there's lots of people that are saying things like that. And the underlying assumption then is that Drupal is for business. And not just some business, but the enterprise. And specifically, we want to attach that label to Drupal 8. And the things that have changed in Drupal 8 then create this story of, well, we're now shifting away from smaller sites to the enterprise. And it's not a coincidence either. So Dries Buytaert, who is the project founder of Drupal, says that I think with small sites, I'm not willing to give up on them, but I think We just need to say we're more about big sites and less about small sites. So he's very open about this understanding of Drupal. This is the story that Dries kind of wants to tell. And why does he want to tell that? Well, he's also open about that too. He says, we wanted Drupal to be what Red Hat is to Linux, and that's why we started Acquia, his company. He says, I see us as being the next large open source business model to reach $1 billion in revenue like Red Hat. We're on the IPO track. So, as my dad used to tell me when I was a kid, $1 billion is a lot of money. And they want to be a big company. And if you want to be a big company and make big money, you need to have big business. At least that's sort of the message that comes through. So then, another narrative that I've seen in a lot of ways that people describe Drupal is to say that it's built by Acquia, because, well, they pay a lot of people to work on Drupal. So we, in actuality, have over 3,600 contributors just to Drupal 8. So to say that it's built by Acquia is maybe partially true, but they only built, to some extent, a very small portion of Drupal. But Acquia does do things that additionally support this narrative or help create that construction of Drupal as something for the enterprise. So they say Acquia-powered, community-driven for their organization called, or their initiative called Large-Scale Drupal. So this particular effort says benefiting enterprise through collaboration. So there's that word enterprise again. So large-scale Drupal is this group of large businesses that are trying to solve problems in the Drupal community and then give it back. It's not even actually clear if it's still going on now, but it has been an initiative that involved people sort of doing work behind closed doors, solving problems, and then giving us solutions. What's interesting to me as well is that it's not just Acquia, it's not just Dries sort of presenting this narrative, but Backdrop, which is a Drupal fork, their developers say the same sort of narrative. So they say, as Drupal moves itself closer to the enterprise market, Backdrop CMS emerges to meet the needs of the little guys. So there we have Backdrop sort of even reinforcing the same narrative, using the word enterprise. And even if you go to their website now, you see the comprehensive CMS for small to medium-sized businesses and nonprofits. So there's plenty of evidence that this is how people sort of think about Drupal, want to think about Drupal, and this is, and this has become, in a way, I think, one of the dominant narratives, something that people talk about. So why would we want to benefit the enterprise, or why do we tell this story? Well, if we actually look at Drupal, we can say that, for sure, we can say that Drupal 8 accommodates this process of moving your configuration from development to staging and production. And some people have looked at that and whoa. I could talk.
Just like pass it around.
Yeah, here you go. We're a small group. So the idea then is that people have looked at this workflow of development, staging, and production and sort of come to the... That's all right. This is going to be the best recording ever. So specifically, people have said it's not hard to conclude that Drupal 8 ties configuration management to a primarily enterprise-focused single-site staging model. So because you can take your configuration, and I'm the co-maintainer for the Drupal 8 configuration system, so I had part of this. Part of the reason that this happened is that we specifically made it so you can move configuration from the same instance of the same different instances of the same site. So it's not made to create configuration that you can share amongst a bunch of random sites. In the past, though, this is actually a narrative that we've heard before. This happened with Drupal 5, Drupal 6, Drupal 7, and now in Drupal 8, where they have accused Drupal of leaving the small sites behind. So some ways you could say this is not new. And interestingly to me, though, there's a competing narrative now with Drupal 8 that says Drupal 8 is for everyone. And to some extent, this is what I believe, is that Drupal 8 could be considered as something that is for everyone. And you had to go no further than the official Drupal 8 site. So this was a screenshot from Drupal.org right after Drupal 8 beta had been released, saying Drupal 8 will have something for everyone to love. So this particular narrative, coming from the Drupal Association, was telling us that with 200 new features and improvements, the upcoming release of the world's leading open source web content management platform will win you over. So how can you have those two competing narratives to say Drupal's for business, Drupal's for Acquia, but Drupal's not for business, and Drupal is for small sites? Well, if you look at other features of Drupal 8, something like the new WYSIWYG editor, an HTML5 markup, and more accessibility, and views and core, I think you would have a tricky time saying that something like mobile-friendly support is only beneficial to enterprises. So there are lots and lots of new features, 200 or so, as people say, in Drupal 8, and I think a lot of them don't necessarily just benefit business. And like my fellow co-maintainer of the Drupal 8 configuration system, Alex Pott, I like what he said, which was Drupal is open source software, and I'm excited that enterprises, not-for-profit, schools, individuals, and Captain Kirk can use Drupal 8. So I think more than that, though, what matters to a lot of people is that Drupal is personal. It's business for them, but it's also personal. And if you look at the language that people use about Drupal, I think it's sort of fascinating. Dries said in a comment of an issue a few years ago, he said, "I've been working on Drupal for many years, and Acquia is my company. And I know how open source works. I know how the Drupal community the community inside and out, and I know how companies should work with the community, and I have no intention whatever to destroy my own child." So he was responding to criticisms about things about Acquia and describing Drupal as his own child, something that he wanted to protect. So this isn't necessarily the language of someone who's simply thinking about Drupal as a business solution. And XJM, who works for Dries in his office of the CTO, says, "People are not individuals, not automatons operating within a corporate machine. Even the 6 of us in OCTO contribute outside of paid time to things that are not part of our jobs, but that we care about." So they care about Drupal. They work on it during the day, they work on it during the night, and they're open about that. So I included this picture of Angie Byron, who also works in OCTO, to illustrate what the evil corporate money grubber might actually look like. But no, this is more someone who has a look on her face of happiness and her arms around Drupal. And I think that picture to me summarizes how a lot of people feel about Drupal. They get excited about it. They want to kind of put their arms around it and say, "Thank you, Drupal, for everything you've done for me," whether it's giving me a job or giving me a community or people to hang out with. But if we look to other communities, we can learn more about our own. And particularly the Debian community, I have thought for a while, seems like there's some good parallels. It's perhaps one of the few communities, free software communities, that's bigger than Drupal, depending on how you measure it, or at the very least, a lot of the same core values in Debian are similar values that we have in the Drupal community. And there's an idea that Benjamin Mako Hill has talked about, he's a professor out in Washington, and he has talked about this idea of access without empowerment. And he says, basically that if you have access to a free software project, but you don't actually feel empowered to make changes within that community, that can be a threat to the community. That if Drupal was not personal, that if it was not something that you felt you could have control over, that this could be a potential problem. And in fact, there was a problem in the Debian community a few years ago that they described as a monumental crisis, or something that kind of shook their community. And briefly, what happened was a few developers were getting together at a conference, not much like this one, and they made the decision that they didn't think Debian should offer support for all architectures anymore, right? At that time, Debian offered support for all the architectures out there, and they thought, you know what, we're all sort of the key people who understand this, and we think that this might not be something we want to do, and they sent out an email to the community, and then people freaked out. And Gabriella Coleman, who was doing her dissertation work, she's an anthropologist, she was working in the Drupal community, she went through all these emails and IRC communications, thousands and thousands of messages, and over people got really pissed. And that she said one of the most significant complaints stated over and over was the email's tone. So that they didn't like being told what was going to happen. The people in the community wanted to feel like they had control over the project, that it was their project and not somebody else's project to tell them what to do. She says, Coleman says, Debian's implementation of meritocracy, like all meritocracies, is a fragile framework easily overtaken by the threat of corruptibility. So if we actually do believe that Drupal is not personal, that it's controlled by Acquia, that it's controlled by other people, and that we don't have control over it ourselves, that can be a threat to the whole project. And the way Coleman described this was this idea of people imagining smoky back rooms, that the decisions were made somewhere else and they had no say in that. So that one email kind of threw the community into a crisis. Now, I'm not saying that could happen to Drupal. Maybe it could happen to Drupal. But that type of feeling about not having it be your own project can be a threat. And maybe another reason why it's important to continue looking at how we're talking about Drupal. But I think it is fair to say that Drupal benefits both the global rich and the global poor, that lots of us use Drupal in a variety of different ways, including for nonprofits, for example, or we have these initiatives that are like Open Outreach and CiviCRM, which are by their nature intended to help do things for good. And there's quite a bit of the community that uses Drupal in a way that makes it that it works for their nonprofit organizations, which sort of by definition make it non-enterprisey because they're doing it for non-profit use. And because they're nonprofits, they can use Drupal, and like the nonprofits, volunteers are very important to the Drupal community. So we do have lots of people that are volunteering. The vast majority of the people that contribute code to Drupal are indeed volunteers. So if we have a threat to this, the Drupal Association is one organization that's sort of tagged, or whose mission is actually to protect the project, to help us from getting into these tricky situations. And Holly Ross, the former now, I guess, executive director of the Drupal Association, was talking on a Lullabot podcast a couple of years ago now, maybe it was a year or so, and she was saying how that there was a underground economy that existed where organizations, Drupal shops or companies were paying developers to work on Drupal, and she felt that the Drupal Association should come in and help make this a more transparent thing. So the Drupal Association, like in this particular case with the D8 Accelerate project, which raised $250,000 to pay people to help get Drupal 8 out the door, was a project that was specifically made to help keep us out of that type of situation where we're imagining decisions left in smoky back rooms, and instead say, here, please contribute to this. Lots of organizations did, lots of people did. we paid developers, we made it very transparent about what was going on. In fact, Drupal 8 ended up getting out the door. But overall, I think we can all agree that Drupal is sort of a messy process, that it doesn't just happen and always go easily and you submit a patch and somebody reviews it and immediately gets committed or anything like that. We know that the whole process of Drupal is evolving. It's messy. Dries talks about this too when he describes open source as Darwinian. He says, eventually the best idea wins, but it is much more wasteful. A regular company couldn't have experimented creating 10 versions of an online photo album and then picked the best one. So this sort of idea, though, does describe what a lot of people like about the Drupal community, that it's messy, that we can have all kinds of different competing things that people can say, this is important to me and I'm going to try and do this, and we'll see what happens, because we can only have like people creating 10 different versions of something if people feel like their version might be the one, or that their version could get adopted. So I think this type of thing is an indication that we have strength in our community. And it's interesting then when we try and control this messiness, to me. Angie Byron tweeted about Drupal 8 during the development process. She said, if you're a developer and you aren't fixing Drupal 8 critical bugs, care to share why? Curious what we can do to help momentum. So it's very interesting, the tone of this particular tweet, just sort of one I chose at random, but her understanding of the community made it, to me, gets encapsulated in this tweet when she asks a question. How come you're not helping to get this out the door? She just is curious and wants to help keep the momentum going. So she's saying, we want to keep this going. We want to get Drupal 8 done. She's not telling anybody what to do, but she's sort of encouraging people to be fixing the critical bugs that were the ones that we want to get fixed to get Drupal 8 out the door. So it seems that a lot of the people that are sort of in positions of power in the Drupal community are kind of aware of these pitfalls that are what are potential. But it's also curious that Angie works at Acquia, and she gets paid to work on Drupal. And there's another quote from Benjamin Mako Hill where he talks about volunteerism. And he says, perhaps the most important benefit of volunteerism in free software development is institutional independence, which means that no company or organization has a monopoly on the ability to define specifications or direct the project. Now, in the Debian community, this institutional independence is understood because lots of companies contribute to Debian, and no one company is seen as having control over that project. So the fear that Dries has talked about over and over again is that Acquia has too much control, and he realizes that this could be an issue. Other people in other communities have found this to be a problem too, that if a project, there are lots of very interesting examples of other projects that have been taken over, and one company began controlling development, and developers would just leave and projects would die. And there's lots of examples of that in free software. So it is kind of we are in a very curious situation now where Acquia controls so much, and yet people still feel empowered to contribute. But I have started personally even wondering about this. Why volunteer to work on Drupal when others get paid? When I was working on the configuration management initiative, there were often times when I was in meetings with other people where we were talking about what to do next, and I realized that everyone else in that meeting was paid to work full-time on Drupal, and I wasn't. And although Lullabot is very generous in giving me portions of my time to work on Drupal core, it felt different because that particular, usually the time that I was spending working on Drupal core was volunteer time because I spent a fair amount for a while. So having paid workers in the community can be a threat, can be something that keeps people from wanting to contribute, and yet Drupal does continue. And it has now for quite some time. And another important reason I think why Drupal can continue in the way that it has is because it's GPL code, because the GNU General Public License keeps people from being able to explicitly exploit a work. Someone can't just take Drupal and make it their own and not let others use it because of the GPL. And I think that is a powerful thing in our community to help protect the software. It's not the only thing that does it, but it is one thing that helps. So, for example, without the GPL, I don't know that we would have backdrop. The GPL makes it so that forks of a software project continue, and as a result, that it is perfectly legitimate to have this fork of Drupal as backdrop, and that is because of the GPL. So, people care about Drupal. They want to help. They want to learn from each other. There were 250 people that showed up for this conference just in our local area here, learning from each other, talking to each other about things that we find important, and we keep finding ways to move forward, which I think is great. So, we want to evolve. We want to evolve the code, but not just the code, the community. This particular session, is community, whereas a lot of the other sessions that I've been to have been about code. But all of these things we understand as being connected. So that community, though, it exists in an interesting place because in Dries's keynote in Amsterdam in 2014, he talked about Drupal as a public good, and he actually looked at a bunch of research about this, and one of my articles is sort of a response to Dries. But I think this idea of Drupal as a public good is also very helpful in moving us forward because it creates a different framework for understanding Drupal that moves us beyond the traditional small site, big site, large sites, for-profit, non-profit sort of matrix. Because a public good is interesting. So if Drupal's a public good, then it has to meet two criteria. The first one is that it's non-excludable, which means it's impossible to prevent anyone from using Drupal. Now, because of the GPL and because of other reasons, because the code is out there, we can't stop people from using Drupal. And that's one of the two definitions based on traditional scholarship in public good. The other one is non-rivalrous, which means if someone uses Drupal, it does not reduce the benefit to others. So those two key features of public goods are non-excludability, non-rivalrousness. Non-rivality? I can't remember how you say that word. But anyway, the point of it is that it exists in a unique place. But when Dries called it a public good, that was also curious to me because public goods are traditionally controlled by governments. So what are public goods? Roads, national defense, things like that. Vaccinations are public goods. For example, to use the national defense, that meets the two criteria of non-rivalrous and non-excludability because, first of all, you can't not protect everyone within the border if you're defending your country, and it doesn't reduce anybody else's ability to be defended when you defend the whole country. It's a benefit to everyone in the country. So Drupal is not provided by the government. That's a key differentiator between other public goods. So the Drupal Association is a 501c3. And 501c3s, by their definition, have to exist for the public good. So calling Dries, or when Dries called Drupal a public good, it makes sense from the standpoint of the traditional definitions of it. It also makes sense from the fact that the organization whose mission it is to grow the Drupal project has to exist for the public good. And I interviewed Holly Ross on Hacking Culture, which is a podcast that I've done, actually, and an Ogcast too, which is free software. I've done, and she was talking about how they were actually considering at one of their board meetings having the Drupal Association be a 501c6. So, not to get too much into nonprofit tax codes, but a 501c3 exists for the public good, whereas a 501c6 exists for its members. So like the Linux Foundation is a 501c6, And its goal is to exist for the companies that are part of the Linux Foundation, not necessarily for everyone. So this 501c3 status is generally sort of a desirable tax qualification for nonprofits. They want to exist for helping everyone. And that's what the Drupal Association is. So it kind of caught me off guard when Holly said they were understanding the changes in the Drupal Association and considering, well, what might happen if we switched? What would that mean for our community? But I don't think that's the way that we want to go. I don't think that necessarily Drupal should just exist for our own members, because I think so many of us within the community want to do things for good, which then by nature makes Drupal political. So, to take but one example of this, one of the clients that I worked with was the American Booksellers Association. And when they chose Drupal, it didn't have anything to do with, well, I shouldn't say this. It had to do with the technology, but what was very important to them was Drupal and the software and the community and what it represented. Because the way the American Booksellers Association viewed themselves was as an alternative to other large proprietary or large online booksellers that you might imagine, but they were the community version. They reflected their values in the Drupal community. When I worked at Wisconsin Public Radio, it was the same idea. We chose Drupal in part, like so many other public radio stations, because we felt the values of the Drupal community reflected the values of our public radio organization. So there's lots of organizations that choose Drupal for what we'd call political reasons. So it's fascinating to me then that while a lot of factors of our community are open about this understanding of Drupal as something that fits within the values of their organization, a lot of people don't want to view Drupal as political. Terry Eagleton is one of my favorite literary critics, and he talks about, well, he has this quote that says, "Most people are too preoccupied with keeping themselves afloat to bother with visions of the future. Social disruption, understandably enough, is not something most men and women are eager to embrace." And I think that's a pretty good description of certainly parts of our community as well, that not all of us want to do Drupal and make it political. We want to do it because it's our job. We want to do it to keep to keep food on the table and those sorts of things, and funding our children's education funds, and houses over or roofs over our head. But if we do want to make change in the Drupal community, I think understanding how we talk about it can help us decide what we want to do next. And I think that if we want to change what we think about Drupal, we do have to change what we do. So we have to change our actions to create a community that we want to live in. So this is getting back to my conception of Drupal as an activity, not as something static. Drupal is something that continually changes. Drupal is something that we're constantly building, we're talking about, we're creating new constructions. Today I have one idea about it, maybe next month I will have a slightly different idea. But I've been discussing a lot of these ideas recently with Dries, and talking about, well, what does it look like to get people more involved, to make it so that people continue to care about Drupal, that when we say that word, that it means something, and ultimately that we can continue to say what we've been saying for a long time now, is that people can stay for the community. So that is most of what I have to say now, and I'll stop there and open it up for questions. Todd?
What are your thoughts, having done all this research and spoken with various people about this, on the future of maintainability and contributorship within Drupal, with two examples in mind? One, I think there's a bit of a cohort of Drupal contributors who got involved maybe mid-2000s, early 2010s, many of whom have matured professionally or personally, and now there are other life commitments that are taking over, and maybe some youthful exuberance around spending a lot of time working on this stuff is now taken over with family obligations and other things. That's the first concern. Second is a lot of hurdles have been put in place under the auspices of quality. The sandbox approval process for new contributors, for example, is, in my opinion, ridiculous. People wait for months to get things approved, and there are multiple stages and security reviews and all this stuff. Whereas before, part of what made it so easy is you just sign up and you create a project and you're good to go. What are your thoughts then on maintainership and contributorship as it relates to those two things and others?
So the second one that you mentioned, with people being able to contribute and create their own sandbox project, that one's interesting to me because it does feel like it's a somewhat frustrating process to do that the first time, because you have to wait. If we look to the Debian project again, you know, they have a very strict set of guidelines if you want to be officially called a Debian developer. They also have maintainers and people that can just do certain things within the community, but they have these processes in place where they say you have to go through this long list of things to do before we give you this label. And yet still people want to do it because people attach a value to that project. And members of the Debian community will say that they don't see any need to make it too much easier. They don't want to have red tape that doesn't serve any purpose, but they want people to have to go through a process that requires them to communicate with other people. And that to me is an important part of our process as well, is that I think it should, you know, getting feedback as quickly as possible would be better. But if what we have to say though is, well, we don't have enough people contributing to this process right now to approve new contributors, then that seems to be somewhere where we should focus our effort on. But I do think keeping that process as somewhat of a social process, or a process that requires you interacting with other human beings, is something that helps keep our community strong. So that's my answer to your second question.
May I just jump in with one point where all of that makes sense? I think the one thing that we're lacking is the label, is the reward of status. Simply then having access to the project space after the first time you get through the sandbox process to submit things, there doesn't seem to be an official label or reward associated with it besides simply access. So if it's working for the Debian community, that's really interesting. Totally new example to me. But one thing that I would point out is we don't have that, like, I am a Drupal developer, I am a Drupal maintainer label. We lack that.
Right. I think we are able to provide those labels in other ways where we tend to be developer focused. So once you can finally contribute, once you have your own project and contribute code, and it could be an official project, there is somewhat of a change in status, I guess you could say, that you're now, you could, your list of commits, can now include your new project, and you can describe that as yours, or you can describe yourself as the maintainer of that project. I mean, I think we have other ways of indicating that. But yeah, I mean, if we had some sort of like certification for Drupal developers, well, okay, we do. That was like a bad joke, I guess. But I mean, I don't think certification is necessarily what we want. The certification process.
It's just as simple. It's that little different. And we're getting into tactical stuff about how to solve a problem. But it's interesting that Debian has this status that they bestow upon people, and that becomes a reward unto itself. And it doesn't have to be a certification process.
Well, what I was going to say is that certification process doesn't involve human interaction. Mm-hmm. So that to me doesn't push the community forward. It's not something that requires, you interact with other people. It requires you take a test. maybe it would be difficult to pass that test without ever contribute or working with other people in the community. But I feel like for the most part it doesn't. It's just like a test you can pay for and get this badge that doesn't mean much. So but I do think that's not an insignificant thing to not have that social action or that social interaction. I think that is a key part of our community, is the social interaction.
But right now, it looks like we don't do a great job of articulating that part of it. It's like, oh, you need to get your code reviewed so you can have a project. But there's a part of it where it's like, oh, we want to see that you can also interact with us on a social level in order to be considered in that. So it's part of for a lot of people, it's just like this. Why the red tape? I don't understand. Why do I have to play this game? So we don't explain that to people. And then on top of it, if we do all agree that that's an important part of the process of bringing new people into the community, we need to do a better job of facilitating it. But right now, the hurdle is no one facilitates it and no one understands why it exists. So it's just like a sesame.
Well, it's also kind of wrong because so I ended up being a maintainer of kind of a big project because I was a co-maintainer and I contributed a lot and did a lot of work on that specific project. And so that meant that I kind of got the bit without having to do the review process just by participating. And I don't think you even really need that. If you want to be a community member and working on dev stuff in core even or on contrib, you can go through and review patches, and you can look at stuff and you can file bugs and you can do all those things. You just aren't cool enough to have your project bit set, which I'm not sure that even matters that much. So
I think we have the idea of mentors already in our D.O profiles where you can list mentors, but I do think it would be interesting to say if you want to become part of our community that we would make that process more official, and you would have to seek out someone to say, I want to have an advocate that will help me get through this process of whatever it is that we say is important. I don't know if we're beyond that point because we already have so many people that are contributing that I don't know how good it would be to change that process. But if we could make it more desirable for people to become mentors, that could then help maybe someone who knew who to talk to help get someone through that process of being able to contribute. That might be an improvement. I guess your first question is also an interesting one to me because the idea of having other things that you want to do or that are important to you besides Drupal is certainly something that I think is important to have a healthy community, to not have people burnt out. So I do think that having more people paying for Drupal developers is probably a good thing. So it's not just Acquia. Finding out how that actually works is tricky, but I do think if we make it so more people can just do Drupal as their day job and get paid, and we can find a way to do that that benefits the whole community, that people get paid, that it's open to a wide variety of people and not just people that have the free time and the social status and the right skin color and all of that to be involved in the process. That if we can work on that process of making it so that people can do Drupal and then have free time to be a human being, that certainly seems like a good goal for our community to me. And I do think it's probably a problem that if a lot of people were just doing it all the time when they started 5 or 10 years ago, that people get burnt out. Seth?
Without government involved, can you give me an example of a public good other than Debian where people are essentially paid by for-profit companies to maintain a public good? So I'm sort of thinking of roads, how would we ever get people to work on roads just because it's pleasurable to them and they want to contribute to the benefit of humanity? And yet, it's an essential public good that we all use and need every day. It seems sort of, I don't know, me as a business owner, my first thought is, geez, I've got enough on my plate, you know, just dealing with why I'm the provider of everyone's health insurance, or on my company, as I'm not personally. But, you know, it's like putting more and more of these types of responsibilities on for-profit companies is very challenging for us. And so we have to pick and choose what are the most important things that we should spend money on, that we can do for our people. And I guess for me, like, the health benefits, and you know, that's a responsibility, for better or for worse, that's on us, that we have to deal with. And some of these other things feel like they should come first before we should be spending dollars on, you know, paying people to work on Drupal. And frankly, it's for some of the same reasons that you mentioned in your presentation. But yeah, maybe that's more of a rant than a question, but take it where you want.
I agree. I mean, I wasn't necessarily saying that that Drupal agencies should have to be the ones to foot the bill. And one of the things that I was raising questions about to Dries's characterization of Drupal as a public good is because he was citing some works where the person was using the word public good, but really that person's work was about all governmental works, and he contrasted that with something called a collective good. And that's more of the 501c6 kind of model, where it is I think that's a more accurate phrase to say it's not something controlled by the government, it's something controlled by our collective, and that we have to somehow take ownership of that and find other ways to fund it. But I mean, I don't have the answer to that. That's kind of the thing that I'm working on or thinking about. But I basically agree that I don't think we actually want government to control Drupal. You know, I went into this sort of, well, what if Drupal was controlled by a government, and the main point being, this seems ridiculous. So really, this whole idea of it being a collective good makes more sense. Mm-hmm. And getting to the point where more people can get paid to work on it that's the problem we've been working on for years now, unsuccessfully for the most part. Mark?
I think one of the other interesting outcomes of that Amsterdam talk was really interesting. And one of the outcomes was the establishment of commit credits within Drupal.org, and giving credit for people for the work that they're doing, not just for code, but for commenting and reviewing and providing ideas and suggestions. And then now we're seeing that take place in the Drupal marketplace, whereas before it was, you know, well, now it's listed by commit credits for an organization when you say, I'm doing this on behalf of my organization. And then that bubbles up, and it's interesting because Acquia originally was, for a long time, they had a lot of paid contributors, so they were at the top. Recently that switched over, and MD Systems is now listed as
right.
the number one. And it is an interesting motivator. Like, it kind of gets into like gamification and things. And I find myself susceptible to that. Like, I get pumped up by seeing, if I can just do a little more work, we'll bump up a little bit higher in the listings.
Does that change the amount that Lullabot, where you work, contributes to your engagement in the work that you're doing, or are you still doing it all in your volunteer time, and you're just giving Lullabot the commit credit because that's where you work?
I do that.
Like, I know for myself, it's like mine's all volunteer time, but I credit where I work because then they show up higher on the list. But
well,
I don't, like, I'm not actually getting funded to do it.
Well, I've been working on a project that,
Yeah.
a module-based project where we are doing on our work time things that end up benefiting the Drupal project through a contributed module and theme. So So that, but, you know, I mean, it depends. I mean, I have some of my time that during the week that I can decide where I'm going to use that time, and sometimes that ends up going towards contributing to Drupal. And if I mean, you've got to kind of find that line of where you credit where you work and where you don't. But I don't know.
No,
I'm thankful for the opportunity.
Yeah.
I have to work with people, and I can consult with people within my organization, and I feel like that's, I don't know.
For
I
what
just think the commit credit thing is interesting.
for whatever it's worth, I think you are absolutely right on the money with that, because that has changed the dynamics of the community. That was that's the only thing so far that Dries mentioned in that Amsterdam keynote that became a reality. And Dries was just saying last week that he wants to look into those data to see if we can learn anything more about our community, to actually have data to try and answer some of those questions about who is contributing and why, and what can that tell us? How maybe that can provide a piece to a piece of, I don't know what's the right phrase or idiom, but one aspect of the solution. So I am still actually quite hesitant in looking simply at technical solutions to the problems of growing the community. And I don't know, I also am not completely convinced that a problem exists now, but I'm concerned about potential threats to the problem, which is why I outlined a couple of things that I think are potential threats and why. So it's a fascinating area to me. Like we were talking yesterday, a number of us, about B Corps and how many Drupal agencies are looking at that, because a B Corp is a for-profit organization that tries to do good, both for its employees, interestingly, and for the world. So there's lots of things that make a B Corp, a benefit corporation. So it's acknowledging that we can have a for-profit company that does things that's good for its employers or its employees and for the better common good, while making money. So that to me is a fascinating area and a potential place of collaboration.
Seth, and to your point of the question about do we pay people to do this, so we thought about this one in Art of Four Kitchens as well. When Chapter 3 announced that they hired Alex Potts to do Drupal 8 full-time a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, something like that. I think that they were the first non-Acquia organization to do that. And it was kind of like, well, that's crazy. Like, it's brilliant, but crazy. Like, they're mad scientists crazy. I assume it's worked out to them. I haven't talked with them about it. But around the same time, we started thinking about the same kind of thing. And if we could go back in time and hire somebody at about that same time to get involved in Drupal 8, help build it and understand what's going on, and follow the issue queue closely, rather than, okay, Drupal 8 is a month away from being released, now we need to start learning, now we need to start promoting it, now we need to start building on it. We would have saved probably hundreds of thousands of dollars in Drupal 8 project overages that we've incurred over the last 7 months. Easily, we would have paid that person's salary. And that's just one use case from us, but if I could turn back the clock, we would have hired somebody just to do Drupal 8, just to build
Do you
internal.
think like if you had hired somebody, not necessarily Alex, but somebody, they're gonna deep dive into something like Alex did in CMI, that they're not, like we hired Eric Dunlap, who was one of the, and Matthew from CMI, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they have across the board sort of, I can save you from all the pitfalls of Drupal 8 type knowledge.
Great point. I think maybe we would have structured it in a way where, like, we need to think about more of the site building aspect, and or maybe you're a free floating person to hop from project to project as we start ramping up Drupal 8, and you learn some things here and pass it on. What we've had to do to try and replace it is we've created a practice group internally So everybody that's working on Drupal 8 projects, they meet weekly just to share knowledge about what's going on in my project, what's happening in your project.
Yeah, we do something similar. Karen does a D8 Celebrate meeting once a week. Talk D8, but I mean, to the point for me, like I think if we can book people at 30 hours and maybe even try to push that down instead of up, and the economics are really tough because you still got to pay high salaries for smart people, and you start to get to the bottom of what you can build in order to still have a viable company. But, you know, having each person have, the problem is we say 10 hours, but the truth is Lullabot eats 6 to 8 of those hours with just email and meetings and, you know, show and tell and all these other things. So it doesn't leave a lot of time.
Well, and then as a contributor that's trying to track Drupal core and stay engaged, like 10 hours a week isn't, it's not time for me to read the issues, but not enough time to contribute.
I do think it would be. I do think it would be interesting if there were another nonprofit organization that was a 501c6 that existed for the good of the members, and lots of Drupal shops got involved and donated what they could, and maybe there was some tax benefits, maybe there was an acknowledgement that Drupal helps the general public, but then that organization, unlike the Drupal Association, if they could fund Drupal development, that could be an interesting solution to the problem as well. So
And why can't the C3 do that as opposed to the C6?
they can, but the Drupal Association has long made it part of their mission not to affect core development.
Okay.
So a C6 though would specifically exist for the benefit of its members, and if those members were Drupal agencies that didn't have to try and like pay, maybe they don't have enough to pay a full person, but maybe they can pay an eighth of a person, and there's 16 organizations, or you know, maybe.
Isn't it kind of like a C3 would be more for the benefit of the Drupal community and Drupal, and a C6 would be like for the benefit of the people that are members of the
Yes.
nonprofit?
And a C3 often has like educational benefits are often one common thing that can make something a C3 being involved in education.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you.